Okay. Firstly, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thanks for having us. So there's a few elements to that question. Perhaps the way I would begin it is to say that it's worth taking a step back. So going straight into how do you get involved in media and then how do you survive it sort of presupposes that you should be there in the first place. And I think that's an important question to consider, by which I mean, really, it's worth, I think, knowing what you're doing there and what you're trying to achieve by being there. So I can only really reflect on my example because that's the one I know best and have lived. But it's also quite a different example, I think, to the circumstances of a lot of other people. So I'm sort of aware that in saying this, it might be of limited use for a lot of people. But I was really attracted to media as a writer. And ever since I was a kid, really, that like when I imagined myself becoming a journalist, which I imagined in about grade 5. And then I stopped imagining it for a while. I went off, became a lawyer. But when I imagined myself as a journalist, it was never on television. It was not really on radio, maybe a little bit, but it was mostly writing. I just loved newspapers. And so that's how I wanted to express myself. And then I found myself in the early part of this century, so it was around 2003, 4, on the board of the Islamic Council of Victoria. So this is like a representative body, at least theoretically, it's a representative body for Muslims in Victoria. And so I kind of had that representative capacity, and a lot of things were going on around that time. So there was a religious vilification case that the Islamic Council of Victoria had launched actually before I got there. And that was becoming quite a big issue. This was early in the post 9/11 era. So we had the Bali bombings. We're about to get the Madrid bombings, then the London bombings and so on. So that was kind of the moment. And I guess what happened for me is that there was the intersection of those two things. So my love of writing, but also a moment of really quite visceral need for the community to have a peak body that had a voice, and that was able to make a contribution to the arguments of the day that were really, really heated, even in a way that I think is hard to understand now. Doing media engagement as a Muslim on behalf of the Muslim community in an Islamic peak body, when there are bombs going off all around the world, is kind of has its own unique atmosphere or atmospherics. So those two things intersected for me, and I found myself in a situation where I had something of interest to say. So there was a contribution that the mainstream media was seeking that I could provide, but I chose to do it primarily, at least in the first instance, by writing. And the reason I chose to do that, a couple of things, apart from the fact that I like it, or liked it, is I think writing's a really important aspect of figuring out what it is that you think and what it is that you have to say. So you're all students. I'm told reliably by Daria, you are among the greatest students that the world has ever seen. So you will know that you've had to write a lot of things, presumably, and you've had to write them well. And I don't know about you, but what I find, and what I suspect you would find, because I think this is true of everybody who writes, is that when you start writing, you run very quickly into the limitations of your own ideas. You do this thing where you think you have an argument and you start writing it, and then very quickly the piece you're writing starts arguing back at you, and you go, oh, hang on, this thing that I've said and thought my whole life is actually pretty stupid once I had to put it down on paper. And so this is a long-winded way of saying I kind of don't trust people who don't write, who aren't in a position of taking an argument or an idea that they have and really grinding it out through that process of writing. And then what I found is that by doing that, the other stuff, so the broadcast stuff, the being interviewed and outside a courtroom, or being interviewed on Late Line, which was like a ABC current affairs show that was around until fairly recently, or the 7:30 Report or something like that. Those things came easier because I'd done the thinking beforehand. So, and I'd forced that thinking upon myself by writing and by undergoing that discipline. So when it comes to do's and don'ts, I guess what I would say is my do's would be not to launch into media. Well, that's a don't really, isn't it? Don't just launch into media for its own sake, as though being in the media is some kind of end in itself. But it's worth having done the intellectual work beforehand, especially if you're talking about issues that are quite complicated or controversial in society or sensitive, and if you're speaking in some kind of representative capacity, especially. And so what I really fear is that we're in an age where thinking and discourse is social media led. And so what happens in social media is that you're not actually doing the thinking because it's all short form. So you don't really go through that process of grinding out your thought process and figuring out what it is that you think and shouldn't think about certain issues, because you've run into the limitations of your own ideas. What then happens is you've got excited within a social media bubble. Social media is really about rhetoric more than it's about thought. And so you rush then into a media landscape, not really having done that. And then very quickly things kind of blow up. But in saying that, I'm aware that I'm not on social media, and I've never been on social media. So Susan's probably much better at commenting on that side of it, including the Yasmin example, because I think that that's got very particular context around it. It's also a social media led phenomenon, in that the original thing that sparked it was on social media. And then you had this backlash that was highly political. So I think Susan might be more familiar with the subtleties and the dimensions of that.
Thanks. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillah. I think, Waleed and I could give lots of sort of tips on how to do well in a radio interview, or tips for getting your opinion piece published. And, we can get into that sort of stuff if you all want. But I think if I would give more general advice from the things that I've learned over, 20 years, 20 years of doing stuff in the media, as both host of things and guest or interviewee of things. And my situation was kind of different to Waleed's. Perhaps it's a very gendered situation, and maybe the women in the Zoom might be able to relate to this, particularly if you're a visibly Muslim woman, is that it was kind of never really a choice for me not to be in the media. September 11 came along. I was a Muslim woman who wore hijab, and media outlets were just desperate to talk to any Muslim woman that they could find about, why do you wear that? And what does this mean? And so it was kind of just thrust upon me. And so it kind of just happened from there. It was not really much of a choice per se, as just the reality of my existence necessitated media engagement at that time. But anyway, of the 20 years of being in media stuff, good moments and bad, a couple of things that I think that I've learned that are useful that I carry with me now would be two pieces of advice that I would give you. The first being, it's probably likely that you have what we would call a circle of cheerleaders, so that you've probably got a group of people around you who really support what you do. Your mum's probably in that group. Like, everything you do is amazing. Well done. Oh, you were so good. Don't listen to them. You are amazing. Everything you do is great. Or it's your best friends in the group chat, or whatever it is, just hyping you up. That's great and necessary. But what is more important that you cultivate is what I would call a circle of critics. And they're the people who, they need to be very deliberately chosen. They need to be people that you look up to, people who you respect, people who are further along in the world than you are, in whatever profession that is. And they need to be people that you sincerely know want the best for you. So when they give you feedback, it's from a place of wanting the best for you and wanting you to be the best person you can. That any criticism they give you is never mean-spirited or to try to destroy you. It's genuinely from someone wanting the best for you, but they're going to be honest with you. Have a few people in that group that you will go to, particularly for maybe big media moments, or maybe after you've said something, you don't know if it went well, or you're thinking of making this argument. Should I do this interview? Should I say this thing? Should I write this opinion piece? And ask them, what do you think? And they will, hopefully, this circle of critics will give you sincere advice, so that if you are going down the wrong path, they will advise you of that. they will tell you, I think you've made a mistake here, or I think you're going to make a mistake. I think you've read this wrong. I think your opinion on this is incorrect. And, I can only speak from an Islamic point of view and from that frame of reference. You want people who will give you sincere Islamic advice, people who will give you sincere nasiha if you've made a mistake, or if you're going in the wrong direction, if you have stuffed up how to correct it, or if you're thinking of doing something, in making sure that you are on that right path. Because the media now means there's always a peanut gallery around you. Everyone's going to have an opinion on what you're doing. And if you listen to everyone, you will never do anything. There's always going to be people who criticize you. There's going to be people who think you're amazing. And it'll be very difficult for you to stay true to what is the right thing to do. So my advice is listen to that circle of critics and tune out everybody else. You can't listen to everybody else, because no matter what you do, someone will think you're doing the wrong thing. But you can't listen to nobody, because there's a good chance you might be going off on the wrong path. So have that select group of people who you really trust and respect, people who you want to be like, and you know that they want the best for you with the advice they give you, and listen to them and don't listen to anyone else. The other two things I would say is if you're Muslim, I'm not sure if everybody here is, so apologies if you're not. This might not be relevant to you, but if, then, make this whatever is appropriate to your own moral or spiritual setting. As Muslims, I think you need to have a really firm grounding in the seerah, because there will be times when you honestly don't know what the right thing to do in a certain situation is. In the media, how do I respond to this? What should I say to that? Having a firm grounding in the seerah, not just in terms of what to say, but how to respond if you're being attacked or if people seem hostile, will really help guide you. And then the final thing I would say is that, a lot of you might, end up with a pretty impressive platform, hopefully will far, exceed anything Waleed and I have done. And it's really important that you always know that ultimately the platform's meaningless. The platform or the role that you have doesn't mean anything, because it will end one day. It will end eventually. And that's whether you're in the media, whether you're an academic, whether you're the head of a company. At any moment, it can be taken away. And if you peg your identity and your sense of self to the role that you have, you will fall apart when it inevitably is taken away. When the audience decides they don't like you anymore, when your employer decides they don't want you anymore, whatever it is, all your followers on social media leave you. These things will eventually happen. So you need to ensure that what you do is never who you are. Have a strong sense of who you are and what that's rooted in, and what your identity is really meant to be grounded in. And so when the accolades eventually fade, or the roles are eventually taken away, as they will be because they are for everyone, it won't shake your sense of self.
You want to say about Yasmin stuff?
What was the actual question about Yasmin? What was the actual question about Yasmin?
So just looking at it as a case, maybe what are the do's and don'ts we need to learn from this example?
From her situation.
Yeah.
That's a really tough one, because her situation was so unfair. It's difficult to outmaneuver an unfair situation. In many ways, I don't think she did really anything wrong. She was up against a behemoth organization that decided it wanted to destroy an individual. And she was one of the unlucky ones in that situation. I think back about what she did on Q&A and the tweet she wrote, and I honestly don't think she did anything wrong. And I think other people had done similar or quote unquote worse with zero attention. And I think she was a victim of, a pretty insidious media organization. And the sad thing for me, and I know this from her as well, we're friends with her, is how many particularly young Muslim women and young brown and black Muslim women that have since said to her, and similar to me, I would never get into the media now after seeing what happened to her. And I completely understand it. I know other Muslim women, because I think there can be, I'm not belittling what happens to Muslim men in the media, but I think there's a gendered element to what happens to women. I know other Muslim women who were very prominent in the media who've left and just said, I can't put up with this. Like, I can't actually deal with what this has done to my mental health. And I understand it, and I think it's horrendous. And I guess all I can say from my own self, having not, like, you know, I haven't experienced what Yasmin has. I just, the outcome being, therefore, that no Muslim woman feels that they can speak in the media is an outrageous loss for our community. And while I can understand it, and I don't blame any Muslim woman that doesn't want to then engage in the media because of it, it just makes me angry. It makes me angry and sort of feel like, well, I'm not going anywhere. How dare that organization try to get rid of us all? So I'm not sure what lessons we can take from it, because it was such a strange sort of storm that just spiraled around her when, a media outlet decided that she was going to become the focal point of all the attention. Like, there were studies done of the hundreds and thousands of words, column lines that were devoted just to attacking her. There was something deeply wrong in what happened there, like mentally troubling in what it did. And I don't know. I mean, what advice would you give?
I think the only thing I agree with Susan that Yasmin was treated in a way that was unconscionable and brutally unfair, and that she did do, I would say, nothing wrong in some kind of moral sense. I guess what I would say is this is where it becomes really a matter of guile. So if the thing about the way she was treated is she was not the first to be treated that way. The Australian newspaper particularly, which led a lot of it, in concert with particular senior Conservative politicians like Peter Dutton and so on. I think Tony Abbott might have got involved. They run campaigns like this all the time, and they pick different people every now and again. And it just so happened to be her this time. But there was a build-up. It wasn't just about that Facebook post, the Anzac Day one. I'm assuming you're all familiar with the details of this, by the way, rather than going through them all. It wasn't just that. There was a whole build-up to it that involved the Q&A thing with Jackie Lambie and the way that was responded to. So I guess all I would say is, while I maintain she did nothing wrong, I would still characterize that Facebook post that she did as strategically unwise, because the situation that she was in was the heat was rising, the focus was really sharp, and I guess in some ways you can only learn this through experience. But there comes a time where you go, what's the upside and the downside of doing this particular thing? And the upside of sending that Facebook thing, I would have said, was just about zero, and the downside was potentially significant. No one would have predicted it was as significant as it ended up being. I think that's important to say. There is no way anyone would have predicted it would have become that. But the downside, the fact there would be a sizable downside, I think was predictable. And so I think part of what this says is you can't go into media land expecting things to be fair, because one of the key things you learn, I think, very quickly is that nobody thinks it's fair. Actually, no one. Everyone thinks that the media is out to get them.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily always true, but everyone experiences the media that way. And so for you to go in and expect the media will react to you in ways that you think it should or that you think are fair is just, you're going to come a cropper if that's the way you go in. So what actually you need, if you're going to get involved in that way, is to develop a really good understanding of media behavior, the environment that you're in. And the thing that worries me a lot is that I see a lot of people, and I think social media has contributed to this, whose whole world is people who agree with them and spur them on, and they become increasingly unfamiliar with the world view of people who think totally differently to them and might indeed despise them. And when you no longer have an understanding of that, then you're very likely to trip on something, because you're still speaking to the crowd that you understand and you're not speaking to the crowd that you don't. understand. And I say this as someone who has to navigate this pretty much every single day. News Corp have been gunning for me for, I think it would be 15 years now. There's been all kinds of expressions of that, front pages of newspapers, endless column inches, and so on. And I've had to figure out how to, place that in context and understand that it's not as significant as it appears when you're in the center of it, but also how to find ways through that minefield. And that means knowing what assets you have. And in my case, I have an asset of a particular platform that allows me to answer back if I need to. But also when not to use it. And all of these really complex things. It's a very complex environment, but you ultimately need to understand it as well as you possibly can before you can calibrate how you behave in response to it.
I just realized we spent half an hour on the first question.
Every question from now on, we get a 10-second answer.
Yeah, sorry. We should be able to speak in sound bites.
Yeah.
Of all people, we should be able to do that. So short from now on.
Yes, but we need to acknowledge that the question was very deep, so the answer is expected to be longer. That's fine. I think the one person saying, if you can maybe position the mic towards you, Waleed, because it was coming faint, I guess.
All right.
And maybe let's ask our audience if they have any question for you. Just raise your hand or jump in if you like, because no one is asking at the moment. Otherwise, I have already questions asked in advance.
Yeah, I've got a question if I can ask.
Sure.
Sorry, from Lockdown Sydney. Thank you, Susan and Waleed. Do you think that what opportunities are available really for Muslim young people? I know that you guys are a good example, mashallah, out there. But should we be encouraging our people in the media, our youth, our leaders for the coming future? The future's looking bleak, and our youth maybe especially in this COVID lockdown in Sydney right now. I can see our young people already who are in the media on this forum right now. What message of hope, or can you give to them, or is there value in investing in media for them? What are your thoughts? Thank you.
Oh, okay, stop me out. I would say this is funny. I would say that when you come to is there value in investing in the media, I guess it depends a bit on what you mean by investing in the media. So the point I would make is kind of what I said before. Investing in the media in and of itself, I don't see as particularly something to aspire to unless you're wanting that as like a career path, in which case you want to become a journalist or something, in which case that's a different conversation and we can have that. But if you're talking about as an activist or as a community worker of some sort, then I think going out with kind of the aim of investing in media seems backwards to me. What I would be saying is that it's more about what investment in your community or in your particular cause you want to have, and you work on that. And then the media stuff becomes an outgrowth of that. And you can use that strategically as and when it's relevant to what it is that you're trying to do. As for having optimism about it, well, I would say a couple of things. One is I'm generally not optimistic about the way that media is evolving. Like, I think it's evolving in a pretty terrible way. But I don't think that's necessarily what that means is that it's getting worse and worse for Muslims to engage with it. Because actually what's happening is there's this huge fracturing of the media, and that is opening up spaces that probably actually make it easier for Muslims to find sympathetic audiences or whatever. Now, when I step back, I don't think that's overall a good thing, because I think the fracturing of the media is part of the reason. I mean, America is the future of the fracturing of the media, right? That's what happens when you have that level of polarization. So on the grand scale, I don't think that's a positive development. But at a micro level, understanding what doors that opens for Muslims, I think there are potentially significant opportunities. Even, for example, just think about how I got involved in media. So that was through writing. When I got involved in media, writing meant trying to fight my way into being published by a mainstream newspaper. So I had to convince the Sydney Morning Herald to publish something that I wrote, or the Australian, or the Age, or the Daily Telegraph, or the Herald Sun, or whatever. That's a hell of a lot of work. Like that's not easy. But now there are just so many outlets there that afford that opportunity. The one thing you have, if you were going to go via writing, for example, the one thing you have in your favor is that there are plenty of places that will publish plenty of things, and they probably publish things that no one's actually going to read anyway, which means you get a great opportunity at sharpening your craft. You don't come into the entry level being like the Sydney Morning Herald, which can become a bit of a bear pit, right? Or the Guardian or something like that, or the Australian. So there are swings and roundabouts with this, and I wouldn't be discouraged about getting involved in media per se. I wouldn't make it my priority, and I would look at the doors that are open now that are different to, or that weren't there perhaps in previous generations. Yeah.
No. And Susan, we want to see your face.
I know, but I'm conscious of Waleed. Waleed has terrible voice projection. I mean, I don't know. He needs some media training, I think. So what can we do? Any more questions?
Yes, let's ask Lena. Lena?
Sorry, Salam guys, that was like really awesome. Thank you for being here. My question was, so you guys talked about, so Waleed particularly talked about how, when you're writing, or, because I write myself, and you're writing and you're interacting with the media, you kind of look at what's the positive side of posting this, what's the negative side of posting this, what's the repercussions. I'm just wondering, how do you deal with, at what point does it become censorship of what you're trying to say? Like at what point, and how do you navigate being like, this is a point that I really want to make. So for example, like the whole Palestine thing that was going on, I remember trying to write for that, but knowing that at the same time that if I, that could then be misconstrued as anti-Semitism and stuff. So, but how do you deal with that, I think is my question. And how do you go about navigating that censorship, but then also being in mind that, I could get, experience negative consequences for saying something.
You go first.
You haven't said anything.
Okay. I feel like now I should somehow arrange this so it's blocking your face. No. No, what are you? Oh my goodness. I'm not sure this is worth a gag. That I think the first thing I would ask myself, if it's something, how do we decide if it's something basically worth saying? And if it's something controversial, how do we know when it's worth the risk, I guess? The first thing I would say is, has this point already been made well by someone else? Because if it has, we're not necessarily adding anything to the conversation. Like if our reason for writing is this is an important opinion that I don't think other people have put into the public conversation, then we need to make sure that that hasn't already been said, because if it already has been said, then we don't need to add to it. We can share that opinion that someone else has made already. We don't need to add to it. And then I think it's, there are always going to be controversial opinions. And I guess we need to decide within ourselves, how important is this issue to me? Is it worth the potential backlash? First of all, if I say this, what could the potential backlash be? If I say that I'm vegetarian, would there be any backlash? Well, maybe blah, blah, blah. Can I deal with this? Is it worth it? Yes, no. If I say something far, far, far more controversial, what could be the potential backlash? And is that worth it? And I think it's also worth keeping in mind, and I'm not espousing a view on this or not, but one of the deciding factors for me on something like this is that if it's a matter that we think this issue is really important, or we want to support a particular issue, whatever that issue is, refugees, whatever it is writing a controversial tweet or a controversial opinion piece the best way to support that issue? And maybe it is. Maybe we'll stop and think and go, this really is the best way to support this particular issue for XYZ reasons. But it also might not be. And I think we live in a time where we feel that just everyone having an opinion is the ultimate contribution to society. But there can be other very meaningful ways, and perhaps even better and more helpful ways to contribute to matters that may not be in the public eye. They may be going and volunteering at X situation or another whole host of things. Each one of these situations will be different, but it's always worth asking ourselves, is writing this thing or saying this thing publicly actually the best way to support this? And you might come to the end and go, look, this is an incredibly controversial opinion, but I'm really willing to die on this hill. I honestly think this is the most important thing. No one else is saying this. This is an opinion that needs to be said and shared. And this is the thing that I'm gonna nail my flag to the mast on this. Then go for it, and then be prepared to deal with the consequences. But don't always assume that the public statement is by definition the ultimate contribution that we can make to social good.
I think that's really true. And I think also, I'm trying to get you in there. I think also what stems from that is having a sense or an understanding of what you think your role is, right? So there are some people for whom their role is to come, make a statement and disappear for the rest of their lives as far as the public is concerned, and that's it. There are other people for whom it's much more important to play a long game and to say, well, what matters is not that I make X statement, but what matters is that I build a level of like a body of work over 10 years, 20 years. And with that comes a level of credibility or whatever that then allows me to speak with an authority that I couldn't have otherwise spoken with. And that means not just shouting from the rooftops every time I have a thought, right? It means actually being far more considered in the way that I arrive at a conclusion and then choose to present it. I'm not saying one is the right approach and one is the wrong approach. It depends on what you conceive of your role being. But I would echo Susan's comments and the concern that I think is attached to them, which is that the idea that there is this impulse to do whatever feels like I feel like doing right now, that's dangerous if it's not really thought through. The other thing I would say is I'm interested that you couched it in terms of censorship, because I get what you're saying. I think that's a real phenomenon. But at the same time, I think it's important for us not to be too quick to feel victimized by that, because one of the things that's important about what you've identified there is actually sometimes that's a really helpful thing to get you to interrogate your ideas with greater depth and make them sharper and more robust. So I find personally, and I found this academically, but I find this in media, I always end up coming up with better things, better ideas, better arguments when I'm scared of what the response is going to be. And I've had to factor it in. Like there's a famous saying, I can't even remember who said it now. It's one of those things I should know because I've said it a lot, and I will know as soon as I get off this call. But the argument is that he who knows only his side of the argument knows very little of that. And it's a really important idea to understand, because I think what happens, and it's happening increasingly, is that we think that just having mastered the rhetoric of our position is enough. Actually, you're only really in a really good position to mount an argument when you can argue the other case, right? And I'm not saying that just because my first job was as a lawyer, and that's kind of what lawyers do. But I think actually it's a really important tool. If you can persuasively mount the argument that you're opposed to, then when you come to put your side, it's actually going to be far more robust. And you should actually be thankful that there are other people out there who censorship, who you fear are censoring you. Not always. Like, I get there are times where it's unfair or it's being manipulative or something like that. But as a general proposition, I don't think we should be too scared of that, even though it means you have to go through some kind of intellectual pain and potentially even some emotional pain and patience in order to work through your position. But don't be too afraid of that, and don't immediately go to the point of saying, oh, I'm being censored, this is desperately unfair. And I'm not saying that was what was happening in your particular case, but just as a general principle, I would say that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the quote was by John Stuart Mill. I could be wrong.
Yes, that's who it was. I knew it was one of
Mill,
these
how
great
could you forget Mill?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you
Yeah,
very
I mean,
much.
it's kind of a bedrock of liberal thought. So I guess, and I'm not really a liberal, but I think that's a really important. I would actually argue Islamically. It's that runs all
So many
through
scholars
classical Islamic scholarship.
Yeah, no, it is. No, I'm a politics student, hence the buzz. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. We have less than 20 minutes and raising hands are increasing. Okay.
I'm going to set a timer.
We're going to give you 10-second answers from now on.
What if we take the questions first and let you answer? Can I take the questions at once, if you don't mind? And then maybe because the answers can be applicable to many of them at the same time. Let's try. Samira, Amal, Janane, and Anissa, can you please ask your questions? And also Emre, I'm sorry to put all these questions at once, but let's see how we go. At least you can consider them when you're answering, not the direct answer maybe. Yes.
Dara, did you want us to just say the question and get the other person to say it?
Yes, please.
Okay. I guess my question was around less to do with the just general engagement of media, but as a person navigating the Australian society. One argument and maybe one sort of concern is that how do you sort of engage with mainstream Australian society or mainstream Australian media without kind of losing a sense of your Muslim identity or values, particularly when we're asked about controversial topics like homosexuality.
Okay.
And maybe Amal, can you also ask your question again? We are getting the questions and the answers will come after that.
Assalamu alaikum. I was just wondering, this is kind of also bouncing off Lena's question earlier, and on the whole topic of controversy. My feeling, or from my observations, is that when advocating for certain issues like Palestine, as a Palestinian, it becomes a lot more difficult and you do tend to face a lot more backlash, just from personal experience and from seeing some of my older friends who have been in the activism sphere for quite a bit. The second they publish something, they tend to get a lot of backlash from certain lobby groups and from certain lobbyists. And that's quite scary as the Palestinian who wants to go into activism and who wants to go into media engagement, because I personally published, but I published in not, those mainstream Sydney Morning Herald beige type of things. But it's how do you approach the situation so you don't immediately get that backlash, because you might not even be posting something that's super controversial, but you will automatically get that backlash regardless. And we've seen that in the media for quite a bit now.
Okay.
Yes, and
I'm just making a note. I'm not playing on my phone.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good that you're taking notes, so we will not miss out anything. Thanks. Janane, you have a question, I guess.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum, guys. My question is pretty much just like, how do you find your passion in the media and where you think you fit in the best? Because like personally speaking, I'm a media student, but I don't really have a passion and I don't really know what area of media I want to like be in. Or do you just recommend like diving straight in and just trying whatever's interesting and just going with the flow?
And Anissa?
Assalamu alaikum, guys. It's really an honor to be in this Q&A session with you. I think my question's quite similar to Samira's, but my question's pretty much, when you're in the media as a public figure, do you often feel pressure to have an opinion and speak on every current affair that involves Muslims? I'm asking from a position of being like one of the few or very only Muslims in a non-Muslim community. So that's my question.
Okay.
Thank you. And Emre, can we get your
Hi,
question?
good evening from New York. Good to see you, Waleed, if you remember me from AIS days. Basically, what do you see is the balance between traditional media and social media in regards to getting your point across? If it's going to take days to get a piece or possibly rejected, do you sacrifice mainstream to get on social media or Facebook posts that may in actual fact get to readers quicker? So what's the balance there? Do you sacrifice one for the other? depending on your followers and how well you are on social media versus your contacts in traditional media, etc., and the editing process. And part B to that, how important is it to cultivate relationship with journalists and editors? I mean, I have my own experiences. I've engaged since my university days, some 20, 25 years now, ABC, The Age, Sydney, and now Washington Post, New York Times, etc. How important is that, do you think, in terms of personal relationships? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Is that all of it?
Yes, I think now it should be enough, I think, for the remaining time. Thank you very much.
We've got 10 seconds. All right, let's just go through it together.
Okay,
We'll jump in.
I'm going to start with the finding your passion one because I think I can answer that most easily.
Yeah.
So the dive straight in thing is interesting. My approach to, I guess, life, but to this part of my life has basically been to, when a door opens, walk through it and then see what happens. So that's not necessarily good advice. I think if you read self-help books, everyone else, you've got to have your 5-year target and your 10-year target. So I've never, ever had any of those, but someone's just sort of said, hey, do you want to come and host this radio show? And I've gone, well, I think it's a bad idea, but sure. In fact, that's how I ended up at the project. The first time I ever hosted a show on the project, I just landed from overseas that morning. I had this terrible headache. I was on my way to give a speech, and the producer called me and said, hey, the host's sick. Do you think you could fill in? And I said, what, like host the show? And he said, yeah. And everything in my head was saying, no, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And what came out of my mouth was, yeah, that should be fine. And then later that evening, there I was on television hosting this show that I hadn't even watched before. So by doing that, I kind of ended up in situations where I kind of had to adapt. And my attitude was, I might make a fool of myself, but that will only be interesting to people until the next person makes a fool of themselves, which is probably about 5 minutes later. And then everyone will forget. And I can just tell my friends, hey, I once hosted that TV show, and then that'll be fine. So in some ways, I think diving straight in is not not a bad thing to do, but you just need to be prepared for what might come with that, which might be all kinds of embarrassment. And also be prepared to understand that when you do it, you should be confident that you're not going to do harm. Right? If I'd gone out there on that first show and tarnished the reputation of Muslims for the rest of the millennium, then that would have been a bad call, right? But if all I'm going to do is embarrass myself a bit, then it's probably not a bad call, right? Yeah.
On finding your passion. Oh, geez, sorry. I would just say, just try different things and try them in low risk situations. So maybe don't host the project tonight. But what I would say is if you get a chance, if there's like a community radio or a student podcast that you can go and have a go on helping to produce or helping to host or write for a lot of those digital platforms that are always looking for opinion pieces. They publish like 15 a day. So it's a relatively low stakes way for you to practice writing and getting something out there. And what you'll find is as you start to do things like that, your profile will build and then you'll be asked to do the bigger things. So then you'll be asked, oh, could you come on as a guest or can we interview you for 7:30 because we saw you wrote this piece on such and such and we really want to talk to you about that. So that will help give you more opportunities to then speak in other things. And then by then you've probably done quite a few things and you've done digital, you've done other print media, you've done broadcast, and then you'll be like, actually, I didn't realize this, but I love hosting radio. So maybe that's what I'm going to pursue. So have a go in relatively low stakes situations if you can to see what you enjoy.
On the question of backlash, interesting you mentioned Palestine. I'll tell you the story. The first time I ever did a solo radio shift, right? So normally what you're meant to do is community radio and then like the graveyard shift or whatever. The first time I ever did a solo radio shift, I was filling in for John Fain. So in Victoria, he is the guy for like 25 years, hosted the morning radio shift from 8:30 till midday on the ABC. So the equivalent of 7:02 in Sydney or whatever. So this is like the high-powered thing. And the first time I ever did it, I was getting ready to come in. I had to get up at like 5:30 or whatever to get into the studio. And overnight, what had happened is that Israel had sent ground troops into Gaza. So that was my introduction to doing like major talkback radio, right? And within the first, I would say 2 minutes of being on air, I had like the Zionist Council on the phone saying this guy has to be taken off air because of his background, blah, blah, blah. Like, this was just, this was my introduction. This is welcome to media. right? Here's the thing that I did with that. I did it as straight as I possibly could. I did it in a way that I felt I could honestly look whoever it was in the eye from whatever perspective they were coming from and say, look, I gave this a fair run. I gave that a fair run. I was moderating a conversation. I did it as impartially as I possibly could. And this is the key thing, I kept going. So Susan and I will have the same story from when we used to do Salam Cafe, which is a show from a long time ago that probably none of you know, but
hopefully none of you know.
yeah. But I remember when we first started that with
I remember.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm sorry about
Let's
that.
never speak of this again.
But when we first got that, the amount of hate mail we got from Muslims was incredible. And they were arguing. My favorite was when they said to Susan, what was it? Does your husband know that you're on this show sitting next to me?
How shameful that you as a woman are on this show with men. Does your husband even know? And
turns out I had a fair idea. But so what happened in that situation was we just kept going.
Yeah.
And eventually SBS picked us up, and then it became quite a thing, and the hate mail kind of stopped, right? Because eventually you build up this sort of credibility. I know when you're talking about backlash on things like Palestine, it's different because these are highly emotive stories. And the problem, I think, with the Palestinian issue, I won't get into it, obviously, because we don't have time and it's too complicated. But the problem with the Palestinian issue, it seems to me, is everyone who advocates on it has a narrative that the other side simply does not acknowledge. And when you have a situation like that, it is almost like there is nothing that can be said without it becoming explosive. So I don't tend to do much on that issue because it's not really my expertise, and I don't see that the world would benefit from me doing that. But if I were to try to come up with an attitude on how I would do it, it would be to try to forge a path that's not the same path that everyone else is facing or forging, whereby I can say something that cuts across the conflict so that someone who, I'm assuming the person reading this is on the other side of it. And I want to say something. It doesn't be everything, but I want to say something that they can latch onto and go, I hadn't thought about that. And actually, I think increasingly, forget Israel-Palestine, just with the polarization of our opinion cycle, I increasingly think that is the best, most important contribution that any commentator can make, is to talk to those with whom they disagree, fully respecting them, understanding, though, that there might be something you can say that might reach them. Not everything, not on everything, but just something that they can latch onto, which I think is significant.
I'll just quickly jump in on that. This kind of gets back to what I was saying before about having the circle of critics, because you will, whether you're talking about Palestine, whatever it is, you will face criticism, and often criticism from within the Muslim community as well. They won't always be the worst, but they will be present, and they will let you know. And for some reason, the criticism from the Muslim community will hurt you a lot more than the criticism from the wider community. So when I published my book, which was called Fighting Islam, it was just all about Muslim women fighting sexism. I knew I was going to be criticized from the Muslim community and the wider community. I knew the Muslim community would hate it for a whole host of reasons. Why are you trying to force feminism? It wasn't a book about feminism, but they decided that it was. Why are you airing our dirty laundry? Blah, blah, blah. And then non-Muslims would be like, we bloody knew there was sexism, and why is there so much sexism? Why is Islam so sexist? That's not what I'm saying. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what I'm saying. I knew that was going to happen, but I decided this is important anyway. I can't stand the paucity of conversation about Muslim women and sexism in the public sphere. I'm frustrated about the way we talk about it in the Muslim community, and I'm frustrated about the way it's talked about outside the Muslim community. So I'm going to put this out there knowing that this is going to attract a lot of criticism, because I consulted my circle of critics and they thought it was a good idea. And also I really consulted myself, and I thought, when it gets down to it, I stand by everything I say in this book. Like, I sincerely believe this is true. And if the whole world hates me for this, I still want to publish this book. I really believe that this is right. This very simple message that Muslim women who are passionate Muslims will have a problem with sexism. That was it. That was the book. And often, in fact, nearly all the time, these Muslim women were using Islam to fight the sexism they were facing. That was the book. That was the controversial idea. But it was deeply offensive to everyone. But I thought, I sincerely believe this is true. And if this is all I produce and everyone cancels me, bloody good job. That's fine. I'm absolutely fine with that. But also, like I said, you got to consult your circle of critics, because I needed people to tell me if I was way off on that. So if the people who advise you say, no, I think you're doing the right thing on this, and you're prepared that this, like I said before, this is the hill you're willing to die on, then go for it. But there should really only be a couple of hills you're willing to die on. Don't be willing to die on every hill, because that's too many hills.
Yeah, you're not much contribution to the war effort if you're just going to die every time there's a battle. Just one other thing I'd say about the circle of critics. Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, one other thing I'd say about the circle of critics is I agree with Susan, it's important to have them. I would try to make them, and I don't know if Susan agrees with this, by the way, I would try to make them reasonably diverse so that you have among them people that you disagree with. So, for example, to come back to the Israel-Palestine issue, do you have anyone in your circle of critics who is pro-Israel?
Yeah.
Who you actually trust, though? Not like a nutcase, but like someone who's like, no, they have a reasoned position from a different starting point to you, and they will offer a fairly formidable counter that you need to be aware of. Do you have anyone like that?
Yeah.
That you can actually talk to? So I know, for example, I have people like that on that issue, but on a whole lot of other issues where it's like, look, I know we don't agree, but I also know you're reasonable. And I know that you will take significant arguments seriously, but you'll also be able to point out when I'm making an argument that's just too much, that's actually just going too far, that sort of sounds good in a Twitter echo chamber, but doesn't actually work. Yeah. I think it's important to have those kinds of people there. So the question about how do you keep your identity?
I think this has to be our last question. So choose the last one to end on.
Well, yeah, right. Maybe I'll be generous and do a few more minutes if they want to stay. Susan wants to get out of here, obviously, but and the thing about keeping your identity,
might have a class to go to.
Yeah, then they can just drop off. They don't need to be here. We could spend this whole minute talking about this. The question about keeping your identity is, I think, is really interesting. I guess the point I would make about that, and I think Susan's better at answering this actually, so I'll just be brief, is the way to make sure you can keep your identity and act in accordance with and be true to yourself when you're in a media context is to work really hard on being true to yourself when you're not in a media context, right? You can't just, I think, turn up and then dial up the Muslimness and hope that will just carry you through, right? I think it's important that you've actually, that you've done the work, if you're worried about this, that you've done the work on yourself so that it's almost like, I mean, this is ideal and would never happen for sure, but that it's almost like you can't help but be authentic to yourself in the context that you're in. Now, that's not to say there won't be questions that are just like, look, there is no way I can answer this question that's true to myself and is going to be constructive in the current environment with the constraints that, because often it's to do with the constraints of the format, right? Like you get 10 seconds, how are you going to say something that's constructive but true to yourself? All I can say about that is there is no substitute for anticipation on that sort of stuff and having thought about it a lot. You will only find that you are in real trouble when you're caught by surprise. So don't let yourself be caught by surprise.
Yeah, on that, I know from myself, I can't remember if you and I did it back in the early days, certainly with female friends of mine, Muslim female friends of mine, when they're doing media. And we know this was, years ago, back sort of like 15 years ago when it was right in the heyday of those standard questions that Muslims get, particularly Muslim women. And we'd call each other beforehand and be like, okay, they want to talk to me about hijab or they want to talk to me about whatever controversial issue. Let's do this. And so one of us would take the role of the really fiery journalist and ask them the hardest questions. And we would just workshop into it like, okay, how could we answer that? Break it down, don't say that because this will sound like that. And if you say that, then this sounds like this. And we just workshop it and workshop it and workshop it until we had as tight an answer as we could that we sincerely believed this wasn't like garbage. This is what we believed, but we had worked out a way, because so often the mistakes I think Muslims can get into when we're talking about these controversial religious issues, which to be fair, this doesn't happen as nearly as much anymore, but we say things not realizing how they'll sound either to non-Muslim ears, or when we say this, we don't realize, but it'll be taken like this. So just practicing it and going, okay, when I'm asked about hijab and I've got 10 seconds to answer, this is what I will say. and it doesn't say this thing that might inadvertently offend someone or whatever, you're never going to get it perfect, because also these are different opinions. Like we will disagree on X, but you will do the best you can, and you can sort of avoid some of the landmines that you might accidentally step into.
I really like the question on and feeling the pressure to have an opinion to speak on everything that affects Muslims. I think, Anissa, that was your question. Yeah, I do know what you're talking about, and I did feel that a little bit, especially when I was at the Islamic Council of Victoria, because in a way that was kind of my job, was to have an opinion on all of these things. I was always kind of keen to try in those circumstances to identify the limits of what I'm saying. So, for example, I could say, look, this is a thing on which a lot of Muslims will disagree, right? That's a really important thing to say if it's true, because, and it usually is, let's be honest, because it conveys that Muslims aren't a monolith, which is a really important thing, because I think people don't really grasp that in a lot of cases. But secondly, it places your own view in context, right? You might have a view about something, but you're not arguing that this is the determinative view or this is representative of everybody or anything like that. And I think there is an important thing for Muslims to understand. There's a difference between feeling pressure to speak every time a Muslim issue comes up and identifying the ones where it's actually necessary that there is a Muslim voice on something, right? So there are times, and the classic example, which I don't think is as prevalent now, is like in the aftermath of a terrorist attack or something like that, where people genuinely believe, right? And we can get into a whole critical discourse about the reasons for this and whatever, and I can have that conversation. But let's just take this as a social fact for now. There are a lot of people out there who genuinely are confused about whether Muslims want to blow them up, right? It's important there's a Muslim voice out there explaining that Muslims don't want to blow them up. It's not apologetics to do that. That's not cowering. That's actually conveying a pretty important point at that particular moment in time, which is, before we get into everything else, I'm not trying to blow you up, right? Because if you can't convey that, then nothing else you say matters. I mean, nothing else will be heard. So there are times where stepping in and saying something, an intervention, is important. There are other times where it simply isn't. And if you don't feel comfortable, then knowing when it's actually not going to make that much difference or it's not that significant, I think is really important. But the bigger point I would make about this, and this is certainly a decision, I was going to say, was it a decision I made? Maybe not. It was probably more of an inclination, is that I feel and felt in my own case, it was really important to have a portfolio of a contribution that wasn't about Muslim stuff. So I remember when it was 2004, when I got my first ever article published in the sports section of The Age. And that was a huge moment for me, because I think what was important was to demonstrate that I'm not simply something that is categorized or can be contained by a particular social category, which is now just politically convenient to talk about. There's actually breadth. There are dimensions to our humanity and our expression of who we are. And so it's very important, I think, to have that kind of breadth. So most of the stuff I write now, or that I do in my media, doesn't have anything to do with Muslims. But it's no secret that I'm a Muslim, and it comes up from time to time. And I certainly don't resile from it. And I'm quite happy to talk about it, but it's not the only prism through which you can engage with me. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think that has a far more penetrating and even more plenary impact than if I was just the Muslim guy who spoke on Muslim things at Muslim times, right? Which doesn't mean 10 minutes later than the interview is meant to be. And then the last question was the balance between tradition and social media. I think that's Susan's. Well, the social media thing. My advice on social media is to abandon it and never look back. So given you don't want that advice, I'll pass you on to Susan, who doesn't take that advice.
I do think there is this place for social media. I do think social media is a sewer, and it's, but like other sewers, I suppose they have their use.
You don't want to live in it, though.
No, you don't want to live in it, but you want to use it for its purpose. But what I would say is that I definitely think it has its place for perspectives getting out there faster and from people that might not have access to mainstream media, that I think is actually really important. And social media can definitely, for better or worse, set the agenda for mainstream media. So I definitely think it can have a role in limited circumstances. But the other thing I think I would say when we are in such a time of, everyone's social media, no matter how hard we try, the algorithm determines who we hear and what we hear. And it's so sculpted to try to support the views that we already have. Mainstream media is a way to reach the people who will never come across your Twitter or Instagram. And I think when we are in a time when we are so siloed, mainstream media is one of the few places that can still cut across that a lot of people, the kind of people that watch Sky News or whatever are probably different to the people that watch ABC or Channel 10 or whatever. I get that. There is still a distinct audience, but there is a greater cut across from mainstream media than there is in social media. And I think, we need to be very conscious of not always speaking to people that might be entirely open to us. And that's one of the reasons we did Salam Cafe a million years ago, was because we were trying to get to people who wouldn't be coming to the mosque open days or those kind of things. And I still remember there was this time we got an email from a guy, a non-Muslim guy, who emailed the show and said, I turned on the TV and saw your show, and I was amazed to see you laughing. I didn't know Muslims were allowed to laugh. That shows you the kind of knowledge that people will have about Muslims. And in Australia, there are only about 600,000 Muslims in the entire country. 600,000 in the entire country of about 24, 25 million people, which means the vast majority of Australians will never have a Muslim friend, colleague, or neighbor. And I think that's where mainstream media, in particular, social media to a lesser extent, is a place where the average Australian can hear from people like you. So I think the mainstream media in particular plays a role where we are when the algorithm really determines who we do and don't hear from, which is why I would say on social media, force yourself to follow people that you don't agree with. Force yourself to.
And on the question related to that about relationships, I think if you can cultivate relationships with like decision makers in media, editors, whatever, even individual journalists, then I think it's definitely worth doing. I wouldn't make yourself an annoyance, because I think in the long run that probably won't help you. I know the way that media organizations work from within, and you can get a reputation where it's like, oh God, there's that pest or that rent-a-quote or whatever, and I just want nothing to do with them. But if there's a way in which that can happen, maybe you want to ask them for some advice or whatever, or you have something to talk to them about that they're interested in, that can then be the start of an ongoing relationship. I think that's important. I mean, I think it's true to say that I'm not in media if I don't end up having a relationship with a journalist by the name of Martin Flanagan when I was at uni, who wrote an article that mentioned me without him knowing who I was, because he was just describing a scene at Richmond's football training after September 11, and I happened to be one of the people described, and I wrote to him and we became friends. And without that, I don't think, I just don't think I enter media at all. So I think, if you can cultivate those relationships, it's important because it can help you either add perspective to stories on background maybe, or it can help you identify stories that they wouldn't have otherwise known, and now they're interested in it because they trust you. So if you can, I think I would do that. The one other thing I want to say, because I suspect we're running out of time, I'm happy to go on all day, but I know Susan really, really doesn't want to. The one thing I would say, actually, no, I think I'm being told I have to go.
Because some of us work for 5 minutes on TV a day and some of us have proper jobs. So I think, that plays a role as well.
Susan thinks I work for 44 hours and 36 seconds a night. Sorry, apologies for taking you into this domestic setting. Just one.
We'll talk about it off camera.
One final thing I would say, and this is, I think, most applicable for Muslims in this Zoom, is there's a lot of frustration, I think, at things being unfair or whatever. the thing I've always found is, and this is very much anchored in our religious tradition, is that things get a lot better when you let go of thinking that you have to change the world. So when you understand this concept, obviously for the Muslims, this idea of qadar, that really Allah's in control, and that's it. And you can do whatever you want to do. You're not responsible for like if Nuh alayhi salam can go around preaching for 950 years and in the end no one listens to him, then I don't think you should think you're going to do any better than that necessarily. So what matters is not what you've achieved or what you have changed or can change, or expect that you have the power to change all these things. Really, our only concern, I think, as Muslims should be, what is it that's being asked of me in this situation? And am I delivering on that? And if nothing changes, then nothing changes. And if everything changes, then everything changes. But once I got my head around that, it all became a lot easier and a lot less stressful. And for the non-Muslims in here, sorry, that probably doesn't mean much to you.
What I would add to that.
Oh, it might. I don't know.
We've got this book you might like to read. It's called the Quran.
No. Have a pamphlet.
No, what I would add on to that is, particularly when we can get this criticism, I mean, maybe sort of not so much from the non-Muslims, you'll get different criticism from them, but particularly within the Muslim community. Why are you trying to defend Islam? Well, you don't have to explain yourself to non-Muslims, like stop selling out, that kind of thing. The problem with that argument is that it's still misconstruing who your audience is. We're not doing this because our audience is non-Muslim Australia or Muslim Australia. We have an audience of one. We're talking to one entity when we do this work. We're doing this because when we try to, as Waleed said, after a terrorist attack and you come out and say, we're not trying to kill you. That's the first thing you need to know. We're not doing that to try to reassure non-Muslims per se. We're doing that because we ask, what does Allah want of me in this moment? When I have to answer for every word that I've uttered in this life, and God is actually the one audience member I'm talking to, what is the right thing to say in this moment? And that's why, remember, I said right at the beginning, the piece of advice I'd give is know your seerah really well. Know in these situations how to be, because that's what it all comes back to. You have an audience of one in this work. The audience of how your essay is received is exactly like what Waleed was saying, is how it's going to be received that's out of our hands. We do the best we can for the audience we have, using the framework that we have, and you will stuff up. You will get it wrong. I promise you. You will say the wrong thing. You will make a mistake. You have to also be kind with yourself about that. And doing that, I promise you, will make you kinder to the other people out there that are trying and stuffing up as well, because suddenly you'll be like, oh, I know what that's like to be in a live audience and say the wrong thing, or live interview and say the wrong thing. You'll become kinder to other people too.
I think we have to go. Before we do, does anyone happen to think that Allah might want Susan to stay for another 4 hours and answer your question?
And this is nothing personal, but it's midnight here and I'm ready to go to sleep.
Mate, you can go to sleep. That's fine.
Go to bed.
Not that you had any role in that, Susan or Waleed.
No, it's fair enough. It's fair enough.
Thank you very much. We really enjoyed the vibe. We can sense, regardless of the screens in between. I think years of experience was like very much condensed and put into 1 hour, 15 minutes. Thank you for genuinely, frankly sharing your experiences of how to be wise and balanced on a slippery ground. I think we really needed to hear this. And I think our audience is appreciating a lot. I'm just getting a lot of messages as well. I can't thank enough, really, 1 hour, but really very intense. As I said, maybe 20 years experience condensed and put into this hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
And sorry, I only just noticed there's a chat and there's so much. I would have ignored just about all of it. So sorry if you said something there that was relevant that I didn't respond to.
All is fine. Yeah, everything was under control. It looked like, we had a good conversation.
Cool.
Thanks for having us, everyone.
And thank you to our audience as well. Selamun alaikum, everyone.
Go to bed, Emre.
Thank you.
I want to see you go to sleep right now, young man.
Live. I can do it live if you want.
Yeah, stream it. That's what everyone does, right?
Zishan's got a question. Zishan, stay on and Waleed will answer your question.
Oh, okay.
If he's still, is Zishan still there?
Is she? I don't know.
There,
Okay. Yes. Zishan.
Zishan just wanted to know,
Oh.
when you were on Q&A with Christopher Hitchens,
Oh.
was he nice to you after the camera stopped rolling?
So he just disappeared immediately.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said you've been waiting 15 years for that
Sorry,
one.
I don't know if that's. I think. Oh, too bad about the Hitchens question. Was this the Hitchens question?
This he wanted to know.
So
Sorry.
what happened is he turned up at the last minute. I think he might have been drunk, and then he left straight away. I think with Tony Jones. I think Tony Jones had a man crush on him, and also I think they were doing a session at like the Festival of Dangerous Ideas or something together, and so they might have been talking about that. But we had just about zero interaction. Either side of it. I don't know if that's disappointment. Or you're happy with that? I get asked quite a lot about what he was like, and I never have a good answer because he didn't really spend any time with us. So
All right, well,
sorry.
Zishan's happy with that.
Really?
All right.
I
Yeah,
hope you're happy with that because it's all I have. I could make up some other thing, but I probably shouldn't do that.
All right. Thank you for having us, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.